This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, predictions of what Earth will look like if temperatures keep going up.
So we're calling it Hothouse Earth because that's what it looked like. It's not impossible for life, but it would be very, very challenging for the current sort of humanity to live.
A world you won't recognize when Radio Health Journal returns.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
I'm definitely nervous about it. We all are. That's kind of what everybody's talking about these days is, gosh, can we imagine a future in which it's even hotter?
As if 2020 couldn't get any worse, record-sweeping wildfires and extreme heat are plaguing California. Then,
the government is able to look at us with full transparency, but we can't watch them watching us.
The vast access the government has to each and every American citizen. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
Earth goes through an ice age every 100,000 years or so. It's been about 12,000 years since the last one. So on the geological calendar, we're on the warming side of the cycle. But Earth's natural processes are getting a strong push from us. Over the last 200 years, temperatures have risen by about 1 degree Celsius, faster than nature can account for, and a report in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences concludes that if the temperature goes up by much more over the next few decades, we may reach the point of no return. Dr. Diana Liverman, professor of geography and development at the University of Arizona, is a co-author.
So we're calling it Hothouse Earth because that's what it looked like. It's not impossible for life, but it would be very, very challenging for the current sort of humanity to live in that much higher temperature, much higher sea level environment.
Hothouse Earth would be 4 to 5 degrees centigrade higher, which is something like 7 to 9 in Fahrenheit higher. And that would have huge, huge consequences for the Earth.
Dr. Catherine Richardson, professor of biological oceanography and leader of the Sustainability Science Center at the University of Copenhagen, is another co-author of the report.
First of all, it would mean a sea level rise of on the order of 10 to maybe up to 60 meters. It would mean much more aggressive storms, drought, heat waves, places on Earth that would be too hot for humans to survive, places that we are now doing agriculture where we wouldn't be able to do it in the future. So hundreds of millions of people, if not more, having to move around on the planet, less area for people to be distributed on. That would then lead to conflicts and social unrest. The plants and animals that we know today, many of them would no longer be here. So the Earth as we know it simply wouldn't exist under hothouse conditions.
Hothouse Earth isn't a sure thing, but even far short of those conditions, we're already seeing an impact. For example, melting global ice means that sea level has risen more than 2.5 inches in just the last 25 years. Dr. Christina Dahl is senior climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists.
We see an increase in the incidence of high tide flooding or sunny day flooding. So this is flooding that happens when there's a high tide that's just above average and doesn't require a storm. It's not a storm surge, not a hurricane. But people are increasingly seeing flooding of their roads, of their yards, sometimes even their properties during these high tide floods. We know that the frequency of floods like that has quadrupled in some places since the 1970s.
Liverman says we can also see the current effect on our weather and ultimately on our health.
We're at 1 degree at the moment, and we're already seeing heat waves. We're seeing fires that are affecting people's respiratory systems. We're seeing spreading of mosquito vectors and others. But once you start to get at 3 or 4 degrees centigrade on the hothouse Earth trajectory, you would start to see real crises in the health system. You would get very different changes in disease patterns. You would start to see many, many people suffering from the high temperatures, from heat waves. And then there are sort of indirect effects. What happens to food supply in a hothouse world and whose nutrition will be affected? Will there be enough water, clean water in a hothouse world? Because a hotter world, more water is evaporated. So I think there are enormous health challenges if we go down the hothouse Earth scenario.
According to the report, hothouse Earth will occur only if temperatures reach a tipping point. The problem is no one knows where that tipping point is. But beyond it, Liverman says a variety of natural Earth systems that keep us cool may start to fail.
One of the most important is that currently the biosphere, the forests and grasslands of the world, take up a lot of carbon dioxide and a lot of the carbon dioxide we emit. And one of the things that we're concerned about, and in fact there's some scientific evidence this is starting to happen, is that absorptive capacity is going to weaken because the forests don't grow as well as the climate warms. You get much more forest fires like we're seeing this summer. And what happens then is that the forests, rather than taking up the carbon dioxide, actually start releasing it. And when that happens, that adds to the warming signal.
Another tipping element that could change the state of the planet, according to Richardson, is the ocean currents.
Right now we have an ocean current system that brings heat from the Gulf Stream to Europe. So it's much warmer in England than it is at the same latitude in Canada, for example. And that's because you get the Gulf Stream there. Well, we know that at times in the Earth's history, those ocean currents have been shut off. And when they're shut off, of course, you get a change in where you have heat distributed.
Liverman says we could also be endangered by the ongoing melting of frozen ground in the Arctic.
At the moment, a lot of methane is kept trapped in the frozen land in the Arctic. But as the Arctic warms, the land starts to melt, and then methane is released from that land. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas that would then further add to the warming. So what we're worried about is the warming that we're sort of pushing right now by human activity starts to trigger these natural systems that, rather than taking up the greenhouse gases, start to release them.
And if one of those natural systems starts to fail, Richardson says the warming it contributes will only feed the next one.
We know a lot about these tipping elements individually, and we have estimates that some of them will go at an increase of a 1 to 3 degrees centigrade temperature increase. Others will go at probably between 2 and 4, and some between 3 and 5, for example. So when you start setting the first ones up, then they can trigger the ones that go at a higher temperature, which then can trigger the ones that go at an even higher temperature. So you can get 10, 12 of these tipping elements all going to a different state as a part of the same process. And that's what really worries us, the idea of tipping cascades, not just tipping points. It's sort of like when we were kids and we had all the dominoes that we put up on the edge and then we pushed the first one and they all fell down. There are so many different processes in the Earth system that are all interlinked. And if we get to the point that we start the first one that starts this chain reaction, then the Earth, all the dominoes will fall, and the Earth will presumably continue to warm till about 4 to 5 degrees.
The Paris Accord on Climate Change, from which the U.S. withdrawal takes effect in November, assumes we'll be okay if we keep the overall temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. That's roughly 1 degree higher than where we are now. But Liverman says that's a political decision as much as a scientific one.
Even 2 degrees may be too warm, but that something under 1.5 or 1, we don't think will trigger these feedbacks. We're suggesting that some of these feedbacks could kick in within the next couple of decades, but that we still have a period where we can make a choice to go towards a more stable Earth, which might be a little bit warmer than right now, but wouldn't have these sort of cascading feedbacks as a possibility. And the sort of decisions that we would need to make if we want to choose that trajectory would involve rapid decarbonisation of the world economy. So that's reducing emissions of greenhouse gases from our electric system, from our transport system. But the other thing we talk about is the importance of protecting these sinks, that if we manage forests, if we manage grasslands, if we manage coastal areas carefully to maximize their opportunities to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, that also takes us towards the more stable conditions.
But if we do stabilize at a modestly higher temperature, where does that leave us? For one thing, Dahl says over time, land will be swallowed up by the sea. In the United States, 2.5 million homes, especially in Florida and New Jersey, could be hit by what's called chronic inundation, or flooding every couple of weeks, even with a modest sea rise.
In the long term, so beyond the end of this century, we'll continue to see sea level rise. And we know that even with an aggressive scenario in which we reduce our carbon emissions, the emissions in that scenario through the end of the century would lock us into about 8 feet of sea level rise in the long term. And then with a more business as usual scenario of carbon emissions through the end of the century, we'd see over 20 feet of sea level rise in the very long term. And when I say long term, I'm talking hundreds of years. So not something we would necessarily see in our lifetimes, and not something that our children would necessarily see in their lifetimes, but certainly in the span of several generations.
That's one thing that sometimes makes climate change difficult to consider. Liverman says all of this isn't really about the world we live in, it's what we leave behind. Richardson is optimistic, though. She says humankind has wrestled with environmental considerations before, though in much simpler ways.
Where our ancestors, when they stopped doing their nomadic life and rushing about after trying to find their food, where they initially let all their waste products fall wherever they were produced, and they took what they thought they needed from nature freely, game, trees to burn and make energy. They then realized for their own sakes they were going to have to manage their resources at the local level because they were getting sick from polluted water, they were running out of things to eat, and so on. So we recognized the need to do environmental management at the local level for our own sake. We then realized later on, as we became more people, that it was also necessary to do it regionally, because if we want clean air and water in Denmark, it can't pay to let the Poles and the Germans and the Swedes throw all their rubbish in the air and water.
Now, she says, we're realizing that we need to step up to a global scale.
And that's what something like the Paris Agreement is trying to do, is manage our resources, at least our climate resource, and the climate resource being the size of the garbage dump that you have in the atmosphere. And so we're starting on this process of developing the mechanisms to do this management. We're at a primitive stage here, but I do think it's coming.
And even though the U.S. government will be pulling out of the Paris Accord, Richardson says a powerful American contingent remains, a group calling itself We're Still In. It's made up of more than 2,900 states, businesses, non-governmental organizations, and philanthropies, whose economic resources total nearly $9.5 trillion, more than all but 2 countries in the world. That's one reason Richardson says the ball is rolling now to the point that a national leader can't stop it.
So I think we tend to get to despair too much about how individual presidents come and go. I don't think individual presidents are going to make or break this agenda. This is important for the survival of humanity. And I think, I honestly believe we're standing here at the moment with our backs against the wall and a knife at our throats, but some of us work better under pressure, including myself, and I firmly believe that humanity has the capacity to do that too.
You can find out more about all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. I'm Reed Pence.
As patients throughout the country begin to return to their allergist's office, a top priority is keeping everyone safe from COVID-19. Allergists are getting in touch to let their patients know about protocols that keep people safe and socially distanced. While some visits can happen remotely with telemedicine, Dr. J. Allen Meadows, president of the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, says that's not always possible.
Controlling allergy and asthma symptoms is as important now as ever, and patients on allergy shots must come to the office. Other types of treatments that are best done in person include life-saving biologics, allergy testing, oral challenges for food allergies, and new patient visits. Most allergists have created strict procedures for in-person visits to ensure the safety of their patients.
For example, masks are mandatory and remote check-in patients can wait in their cars instead of the waiting room and may even receive some services in some practices in the parking lot. Find out more at acai.org.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Radio Health Journal is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.
Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal,
what the corporate expectations are for number of prescriptions dispensed, number of vaccines administered. Some pharmacies that use those metrics for bonuses or performance review.
why your local pharmacist may fill prescriptions as fast as they can.
Then America's anger epidemic.
Anger is a normal emotion. It's part of what it means to be human and has great many values for us in terms of our not only our own personal well-being, but in our relationships.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.